Quiero invitar ahora a participar a nuestros destacados profesores al debate y, por supuesto, a todos ustedes a entregar ya las preguntas que tengan preparadas para ahora. Y después recuerden que el premio es un rico cóctel que vamos a disfrutar entre todos al término de este debate. Voy a invitar al escenario a los dos profesores que nos acompañan, a la profesora Stewart y el profesor Sidanius. If you can come and sit down over here. Y también vamos a invitar a los otros participantes de este debate, que van a ser Roberto González y Kirsten Sehnbruch. If you can sit over there, better, yeah. Así, tú, Kirsten. Thank you very much. You can sit here. Kirsten, tú ahí, al lado de ella. Sí, yo me pongo acá. ¿Ya? Bueno, los dos académicos chilenos van a conversar y van a entrevistar a los expertos invitados hoy a este lanzamiento del COES, así que les doy la palabra y yo voy a interpretar al público, así que cuando puedan me van entregando sus preguntas. ¿Comencemos con preguntas? ¿Sí? ¿De ustedes? ¿la traducción simultánea no está funcionando? Ahora está funcionando, ok. Roberto, ¿quieres comenzar tú?
Perfecto. Voy a dirigir una primera pregunta general que está referida al rol que cumple COES, el centro que acabamos de lanzar. Nosotros decimos que este es un centro de excelencia que debe contribuir al desarrollo de la investigación en los ámbitos del conflicto y la cohesión social. Considerando el contexto internacional, al juicio de ustedes, ¿cuáles debieran ser los principales temas que este centro no debiera dejar de abordar en su agenda de investigación? Son temas prioritarios, que ustedes tengan la experiencia conociendo investigación a nivel internacional.
No sé quién quiere tomar la palabra. Profesor Stewart.
Well, that's, quite a question just to throw at us, but I think that group inequality is hugely important, and I think it should be by gender, by ethnicity, and by region in this country. And there'll become a time, I think, maybe by age as well, but I would give that real priority. The second issue is what is commonly known as social capital and the relationships among people, both across groups and within groups, the trust and so on, which is very important for social cohesion.
Yeah, another thing I think is really critical to understand is the sort of organized and disorganized opposition towards equality. It's, as Francis said, very destructive for societies to be too unequal. But political efforts to equalize opportunity across societies is very often strongly resisted. And it's important for us to understand the dynamics of that resistance in order to overcome it. And in the United States at the moment, it is extremely difficult to get winning coalitions politically to do something about all the problems that Francis spoke about. So it's really important to study political organized resistance against equality of opportunity. Not equality of outcome, but even of opportunity is extremely resisted.
Si me permiten también participar con algunas preguntas, hablando de resistencia, como mencionaba el profesor Sidanius, en Chile, para llevarlo al contexto nacional contingente, estamos en medio de la discusión en el Congreso de una reforma tributaria bastante importante que ha sido resistida por más bien los grupos políticos de derecha o conservadores en nuestro país porque ellos consideran que una reforma tributaria podría tener serios efectos en crecimiento y empleo, y hay una disyuntiva entre conseguir más impuestos, o sea, recolectar más impuestos versus efectos en crecimiento y empleo. ¿Cómo ven ustedes esa disyuntiva y qué reflexiones podrían hacer sobre este proceso que estamos viviendo acá en Chile?
Well, I first think it's an exciting process, an important process. And, you know, people always do resist. I absolutely agree with what Jim said. There is big resistance, and people don't like losing what they've got, which gets back to the advantage of pre-distribution. But they will resist, but I think you have to take their arguments at their face value. I personally think there's an underlying agenda which may not be the arguments they're presenting, that they don't want to lose. But I think you take their arguments at their face value, and your research centre can precisely challenge them. That if we look around the world, it is not the case that more equal societies have less growth, have less employment, and so on. It's just, they're just wrong about that.
¿Y cómo lo convencería usted, profesora Stewart, a los empresarios chilenos o a los grupos, o los partidos digamos, que están en la oposición actualmente en el país, de que precisamente eso que usted dice de pagar más impuestos quizás pueda ser beneficioso y que los países que pagan más impuestos también crecen? ¿Con qué argumentos los convencería? ¿Cómo ellos pueden llegar a pensar que pagar más impuestos no es perder sino ganar?
Well, I think you have to cite evidence from other countries which have paid more taxes and have good growth, and evidence from countries which have low taxes and have bad growth and have social inequality and have protest and a lot of costs to having high inequality, and point to those costs with good empirical examples. I mean, that's, I think, the best that you can do.
One of the things, I don't want to be pessimistic about this again, but I've noticed is that if people have vested interests in resisting equality of opportunity, it is extremely difficult to convince them otherwise using empirical evidence. They simply will not accept the evidence. Political mobilization is important in order to sort of do an end run around this solidly compacted and organized resistance. But empirical evidence alone is not going to win the argument. It's really got to be a political movement on the grassroots which forces these reactionary powers within societies to accept this empirical evidence.
Kirsten.
Jim's comment makes me think about the student movement that we had in Chile that is, I think, a well-known topic, and which has put many of these issues onto the agenda. Many of the policies that are now being undertaken in Chile are effectively policies directed at horizontal inequalities or are predistributive, although it hasn't been phrased in those terms, it hasn't been phrased along those lines. But one of the problems with these mobilizations is that they tend to mobilize the groups who can organize themselves and can mobilize. And of course the problem is with the groups who cannot mobilize, the elderly or the infirm, etc. And that of course is where the empirical evidence becomes very, very important, and where the communication, the way these issues are communicated, becomes very important. And it's there where I think also the experience of other countries could be very useful. So I was going to ask actually both speakers, since the crisis of 2008, 2009 in the United States, which I think has produced a significant sea change in how we think about these things, how do you see that affecting how the issue of distribution is being perceived at the international level, both for developed and also developing countries? And what does that then allow us to say about how groups can interact with each other?
Well, initially, I think the crisis really made people think twice about inequality, because huge amounts of government money was used to bail out big companies, and these big companies continued to pay huge bonuses, although they were basically bankrupt and being bankrolled by the government. And I think that is behind a lot of the outrage of the inequality, and as I said, in Switzerland, it's had real effects. But over time, I think, unfortunately, it's sort of wearing out. And we're back to a situation in which the bankers are saying, we have to pay these high salaries to get the most efficient people, even though it was they, with their high salaries, who were the cause of the crisis, so they were hardly the most efficient people. But they're going back to that. They're going back to saying, you know, we must be globally competitive. I think at the European level, the EU is, as I said, taking some action. And it very much depends on the political complexion of each government. And we're back to politics being all important at the end of the day. And I absolutely agree, political movements and so on to enforce politics. So that we find that in the UK, where we have a right-wing government, they are outraged at the idea of doing anything about top salaries. But in France, in contrast, where there is a left-wing government, they have been really seriously considering it at the EU level. Whether, you know, variety of politics, they're making much more progress. So I do think the reaction has been different, but it's certainly brought consciousness throughout society for the first time to this issue. I do think that people are now really looking at the data. They're looking at the fact that real wages have continued to fall even while incomes are recovering, both in the US and the UK. And this is really beginning to speak to people. But I don't know what will happen, because the other big and depressing trend is that money is becoming more and more important in politics. And that means that, you know, you don't necessarily get the good answer. It maybe money speaks.
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize what Francis just said about the power of money in politics. What's happened in the United States is a number of Supreme Court rulings basically argued that money is voice, money is, has political interests, and that there are going to be no restrictions, basically, on money in politics, which makes genuine political and economic reform in countries like the United States extremely difficult, if not impossible, in the near run, or in the short run or the long run. So I think the first question would be to develop a strategy, a political, legal strategy for combating Supreme Court decisions of the type that have been taking place in the United States. And how that's to be done is a question I don't have an answer to. But without those kinds of legal barriers, we're not going to make much progress, at least not in the States. It might be much easier to do in smaller social democratic countries, to have them, to mobilize the poor and the working class and the lower middle class. With countries that don't have these institutional legal barriers to equality, of political equality. So that might be one place to start.
Quiero invitarlos ahora a que nos ayuden a pensar. Este centro tiene la virtud de contar con profesionales académicos de múltiples disciplinas, sociólogos, economistas, historiadores, antropólogos, arquitectos, urbanistas, cientistas políticos. ¿Cómo creen ustedes todas estas disciplinas pueden articular, basados en su experiencia, el desarrollo de nuevas teorías o modelos donde convivan explicaciones de distinto nivel? La fuerza que tienen las disciplinas para buscar explicaciones son muy arraigadas. ¿Cómo ven ustedes la posibilidad de que estas disciplinas construyan nuevos modelos conceptuales que integren explicaciones de distinto orden y nivel, basadas en su experiencia?
What I forgot to emphasize in the presentation I gave was the multi-leveled dynamics of societies and understanding these problems. That it's not just a matter of politics or economics or psychology, but it's the interaction among all of these levels of analysis, which is going to be able to enable us to gain a keener understanding of just how complex these processes are and how they interact with one another. And so the ambition of this center to bring together both social scientists across a broad range of social sciences is really critical to being able to develop multi-leveled interactive models to understand these phenomena. We don't have this yet in any academy as far as I know, and I think you are to be praised for the effort or the desire to do this. It's critically important that it be multi-leveled.
Yes, I totally agree. And I'd just like to reflect. I had the experience of directing a center on conflict and inequality and human security. And in that, we were multidisciplinary. And I can't overemphasize the importance of that. If we were looking at conflict, we needed political scientists to understand the conflict, to understand the political system. We needed economists to understand the inequality, the sources of the inequality. We didn't have, but we went outside to find some social psychologists to understand why groups behave as they do. I mean, obviously we didn't understand all these things, but we tried to understand these things. And without all those disciplines, I think we just couldn't begin to tackle these issues. Because the trouble is, issues are not monodisciplinary. They're not just economic issues or just social issues. They are problems with many, many sources, and I think it's absolutely critical that the center should have, and I congratulate you, should have people from different disciplines.
Quería preguntarle a la profesora Stewart respecto de otro de los puntos que ha habido aquí en Chile respecto a esta polémica de la reforma tributaria. Cuando los chilenos, si tienen que pagar más impuestos, ese dinero en el fondo va a ser administrado por el aparato estatal. Hay polémica respecto de si el dinero debe ser distribuido por cada persona individualmente o por el aparato estatal. Me estoy hablando en términos general y amplio, en términos ideológicos, en la discusión. ¿Se requiere para una mejor distribución o predistribución, como mencionaba la profesora, un aparato estatal muy competente? Y yo no sé si ese es el caso de Chile, en el sentido de tener un aparato estatal pequeño, muy eficiente y tremendamente preparado para hacer una buena distribución. Si le parece a usted que es así o no. Porque si tiene un aparato estatal malo, por mucho que distribuya el dinero, no sé, quizás no se va a llegar a un buen resultado.
Well, my experience from around the world, I want to say two things about my experience around the world. First of all, that governments vary a lot, but on the whole, even bad governments are better than no governments. So governments may not put all the money into the right people's pocket, but without the government, the poor just get nothing. So I think around the world, when you look around, recently social protection has become very universal. It's made a huge difference to poverty. And so even bad governments are often better than no governments. But the second point I want to make is that, and I'm a development economist, worked many, many years on many different countries. Chile is outstanding actually in its efficiency in terms of a government. When you're here, maybe you see the problems. When you're outside, I have so many students who want to say, why can't Peru be more like Chile? Why can't Bolivia be more like Chile? Why can't, that their real aim is to understand Chile and then to transfer the experience. So maybe inside there are lots of room for improvement, but I think you should think that you have a good government and that it could be given the responsibility of allocating resources without too much worry.
Kirsten, ¿quieres preguntar algo más?
Drawing on the vast experience of both speakers in their respective fields, I was wondering whether you could give us more specific examples from what you've seen around the world of policies that work, of countries where a particular policy or a government or even perhaps a political or social mobilization has made a significant difference, and that we could perhaps look at in more detail in order to learn from them?
Well, I would, my greatest experience with that, answering that kind of question is based upon my experience as a political organizer in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement. And there's been tremendous improvement in the position of minorities and women in the United States as a function of constant and coherent and deliberate political mobilization. One of the problems I see with the 1% movement is the fact that it really did not have sustained political organization and political leadership. It was very spontaneous and very interesting and very attractive for that. But it needs everyday, deliberate, conscious, and organized leadership in order to be effective.
Yeah, I totally agree about the need for organization and so on. And if you look around the world at very poor groups who've done better, it's always because they've managed to get together. For example, even scavengers in some parts of the world have organization and groups and manage to improve their terms of trade. If you think about, a bigger sort of scale, in India, there have been huge movements which ended up with the National Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is an amazing scheme for a very poor country. It guarantees every household 100 days work a year at a good minimum wage, which really puts a floor under poverty. And this didn't just happen, the government didn't just give it, it was the result of a big, big movement which went on for a long time. And they've similarly had a movement recently on the right to food, and it's not yet materialized in exactly what's going to happen, but there is huge pressure on the government. Of course, the government has now changed, but there will be pressure on this government to deliver on that. In my own country, the working class movement, trade union movement, was behind the big reforms. It gradually got more and more powerful during the 19th century through organization, and was behind some very important reforms in the first part of the 20th century, and went on in the end to manage to get a Labour government elected, and then huge reforms again in the middle of the 20th century. And we find that income distribution really improved between the beginning of the 20th century and the middle, but unfortunately that improvement has been gradually eroded. One problem is that there is a new way in which movements are being divided, and it really comes back to the lecture of the first lecture, because what's happening is that working class movements are being divided by deliberate divisions across races and divisions across groups. And now, for example, at the moment, right-wing governments are using fear of immigration as a way of undermining movements towards the improvement of working class and towards the election of left-center sort of governments. So that what is really a problem of the in-group, the out-group that we were told about, in forming these movements. It's much easier to form it within a single group, but if you need a more cohesive group, then it becomes much more difficult to form. But I think at the end of the day, the group formation is absolutely critical.
Veo que tienen algunas preguntas del público que podemos empezar a realizar. ¿Quieres comenzar tú?
Bien, vamos a comenzar. Una pregunta de César Andrade, de la Universidad Diego Portales. Para ambos, sabiendo que en todos los niveles educacionales se nos prepara a las personas para un mercado laboral competitivo, ¿cuál o cuáles debieran ser el rol que tenga la educación para reducir la inequidad y aumentar la cohesión social?
Well, I think as this question sort of implies, knowledge of the dynamics of social inequality and social restriction of opportunity across the society is extremely important. How, again, you get societies to extend that kind of educational opportunity and knowledge broadly across the society is, again, political and sort of difficult to accomplish, but I think it's extremely critical. I take one example from the United States. As some of you might know, the rate of imprisonment of the poor in the United States is accelerated. It's extremely high. The United States has the highest per capita imprisonment rate on the planet, higher than the People's Republic of China or Russia or any other country. The average African American male in the United States has a 33% chance of being in prison sometime in his life, either in jail, prison, on probation, or on parole. Now, knowledge of this phenomena is gradually seeping through the society, but it is not broadly enough known in order to enable the parties that need to be involved in this to get actively organized and do something about it. And here we have another example of extreme inequality, which is not being politically addressed at all because of, among other things, lack of knowledge.
I think education is very, very important to people's opportunities, and unequal education means unequal outcomes, obviously. And one of the findings of our research, we compared the education of indigenous people in Peru with the rest of the population. Not only was the education much less, so hardly anyone was going to university, for example, but the quality of the education was much less, and the incomes they earned when they finally got their education was much less. So they had very little incentive really to go to school, and when they went there, they didn't really improve their opportunities. So it's a question of spreading educational opportunities to everyone equally, but not just quantity, but quality is as important as quantity. And at the end of the day, it has to be economic opportunities as well, because it's no good giving people education, and then when they apply for the job, like some of the evidence we got, then they're not given the job. They're even disqualified because they're overeducated. So you have to work on the labor market, and you have to work on economic opportunities as well as on education. But education is very, very important.
Actually, first of all, I would like to thank the audience, because we got some wonderful questions here, all very interesting. And so thank you for your participation in this debate. One question for Francis. Do you agree with the Piketty solutions, and what is the real possibility for a democracy to establish a maximum wage as an international consensus? Perhaps generally you could say a few words about how the Piketty book has been received and what impact you think it will have on the debate on inequality.
Well, I think that I do agree with Piketty's solution, but I don't think that it's all that politically feasible, I have to say that. His solution is basically to have a tax on capital at a global level. Not a very high tax, and a tax only on huge fortunes, not just everybody's capital. And I think that that is an excellent solution, and I think we should have it. But politically, are we going to have it? We've talked already about the power of money, and I'm dubious. And that comes to the maximum wage. I think what is much more likely is that we change people's attitudes and conventions and norms such that it becomes totally unacceptable, embarrassing indeed, to have such high wages. And I think that's where we're going to have to start, rather than expecting legislation tomorrow. So I think that's the beginning. As far as the impact of Piketty's book is concerned, it's really had a very big impact, but at the same time there's what's often known as a pushback, unfortunately, as you would expect. So the impact is it's put on the agenda this the increasing inequality in a way that it was not before. It's introduced into people's consciousness. And also it's drawn our attention to capital, wealth, as opposed to income, which previously was the prime focus. So I think it's hugely important. And then he's got a theory, which I have a few qualifications about the theory. Everyone who reads it has different qualifications, but it's still very powerful, and we really need to think about it. So hugely important. But of course, as I said, there's a pushback. People are questioning the data. I think they're wrong. They're questioning the theory. Sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're right. So I think its initial impact is bigger than its long-term impact. But I don't think we're going to be able to push inequality off the agenda very easily.
Roberto.
Quisiera tomar otra importante idea, pedirle al profesor Sidanius que nos ayude con alguna reflexión sobre iniciativas o políticas que contrarresten la experiencia cotidiana de abuso, de exclusión, de personas que tienen menor posición de poder. ¿Qué iniciativas o políticas conoce o existen que puedan ayudar a que esto cambie? Este mensaje que usted nos entrega hoy día, una pregunta que hace el profesor Vicente Espinosa en la Universidad de Santiago.
Generally, when I'm asked questions like that, my answer goes that I don't feel in a position to make strong policy recommendations to do much of anything until we understand the phenomena very well. I do not think we have a complete and solid understanding of the dynamics of intergroup discrimination and prejudice. And any recommendation I would make would be, I think, premature. But on the other hand, we know of some policies that do at least make things somewhat better. In Holland in the 1980s, it was recognized that foreign immigrants to Holland were discriminated against in the labor market compared to native Dutch people. And politically, the decision was made that anytime a native Dutch person and an immigrant were applying for a job and there was equality in their records and in their qualifications, the policy would be, the decision rule would be, you always give the job to the immigrant, right? And when that kind of policy was followed up after a number of years, it was not the case that immigrants were being favored or there was bias in favor of the immigrant. There tended to be no bias at all, one way or the other. It equalized the chances of immigrants and native Dutch people to get a particular job. But how do you get a policy like that through national legislatures and state legislatures, given the political environment that we're now in? I can't imagine that that policy would be sustainable or possible to legislate in the current political environment. But that is a concrete measure of what one would have to do in order to make situations equal. But it's not likely to happen politically on a broad basis.
Quiero aprovechar de preguntarle al profesor Sidanius respecto de eso que usted está hablando, pero enfocado en la mujer. ¿Cómo explica usted o qué reflexiones hace sobre el hecho de que todavía las mujeres en todo el mundo seamos discriminadas tan profundamente en términos de salario, en términos de oportunidades laborales, en términos de puestos en empresas privadas, en directorios, en los gobiernos, en los parlamentos? Cuando, viendo sus teorías que explicaba, usted hablaba de personas que quizás son desconocidos a los grupos de pertenencia, pero las mujeres somos parte de todos los grupos de pertenencia, somos las madres de los hijos, somos las abuelas, somos las hermanas. ¿Cómo se explica hoy, en pleno siglo XXI, que todavía siga habiendo tal discriminación contra la mujer?
If the models that we use to understand gender discrimination and patriarchy are based on evolutionary psychological models, and those models argue essentially that men are inherently more aggressive and dominance-oriented than women are, and seek power to a greater extent than women do. And so you can legislate that women and men will have the same opportunities. But if the males in your society are much more oriented towards grabbing power and maintaining power compared to an equally qualified woman, it's going to be very difficult to do anything about that. What you can do is try to minimize the political power differences between men and women across societies. And someone, I think Francis mentioned the egalitarianism we have in Sweden. Right? There you have the smallest income differential between men and women that I know of. But it's still not the case. It is still the case that men in Sweden earn more money for the same job compared to women. And so the question is, how can we minimize that natural tendency for males to dominate and try to control women? And it's not the same dynamic, we argue, as racial discrimination. So sexism is not just, racism against women. It has a different dynamic altogether, and it's important for us to recognize that.
Yeah, I'll just add something. I think you can do something by legislation. I mean, I'm not denying everything you've said, but in India, they have made a law that in the panchayat, that's the local village councils, women have to be 1/3 of the members. And it has made a real difference to the decisions of the panchayat, to the women's own respect, and so on. And there's been a lot of research, very sort of respectable econometric research, looking at what's happened, and it's been very positive. And then I'd just like to reflect on a personal experience of mine. I've been head of a department in Oxford. I was a head of a department of development studies for 10 years. And during that time, we made so many female appointments. And it wasn't that I was looking for women, they were equally. But I stopped being head, and after a couple of other people, a male became a head, and the appointments just went to the men. And I know this is just one example, it's not science, but I think that if women get power, it automatically rights the sort of bias that there is. And I think that's one really important thing, that we should insist that women should be proportionally represented in powerful positions.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a certain amount of elasticity in the degree of power differential between men and women across societies. And you've given one example where legislation can improve the situation. I'm simply arguing that equalizing the situation there's no data that indicates that they can be equalized over the long term. We have never observed a society in which gender discrimination does not exist. It seems to be a human universal. So rather than denying that, I think it's important for us to recognize that and then do everything in our power to fight against this natural tendency for males to dominate political discussions and to dominate politics in society. But that's on top of recognizing that there are these inherent differences.
But you're talking about positive discrimination, right? And now it's also been discussed in Chile about that issue. And people think that maybe women that are not the best are going to get to certain posts just because they're women.
Well, I mean, there are an awful lot of talent. If you have discrimination, it means that a lot of talented people are not getting jobs they should get. So I think that if you have positive discrimination, you're beginning to reach that talent. And the evidence on affirmative action, and I've looked at that as part of the sort of process of worrying about group inequalities, taking the evidence of affirmative action around the world, we don't find worsening efficiency and so on. There's no particular evidence that it's improved efficiency, but it's neutral. It hasn't worsened efficiency. At least that's my reading of the evidence. For example, in the affirmative action in the United States, the policies in Malaysia. I mean, there are a whole lot of other examples. So I would say what you do with positive discrimination, well, to some extent what you want is to eliminate actual discrimination and have a fair playing field. And sometimes the only way to do that is having positive discrimination. But just having very, very strong anti-discriminationary laws can make a huge difference. And they did that in Northern Ireland. And they, in fact, corrected the inequalities between Catholic and Protestants by simply eliminating discrimination that was already there. So that's not even positive discrimination. Then the next step is, if that doesn't work, positive, and I don't think you will have efficiency cost.
Thank you.
Una pregunta de Edgardo Cerda de la Universidad de Chile. Con la reciente discusión sobre la desigualdad, ha sido notoria la diferencia en el enfoque de una política social en distintas economías. En particular está la política social universal, que otorga a todos los miembros de la sociedad iguales beneficios. Y por otro lado, una política focalizada en la cual se identifica y se otorga mayor beneficios a quienes más lo necesitan. ¿Cuál es el efecto de esta última sobre la discriminación arbitraria y la desigualdad? Para que ambos puedan comentar.
I think it depends a bit on politics, really, because in some contexts you can get support for very targeted groups, which you can't get for your universal policies, because people see that there is a small group which is really in need. But the danger of the targeted groups is that you miss out on a lot of people who are needy. And so normally, if we're talking about poverty, and you try and target just people who fall below a certain income level, you find that there are a whole lot of people that you've missed out in one respect or another. And so you can make a lot of errors of omission. Now, if you give universal targets, you have no errors of omission. You may reach a lot of people who don't need it, and people don't like that, but you don't have errors of omission. So I think it's a thing to balance up. But in general, I think universal benefits have a lot to be said for them.
Yeah, besides that, one major advantage of universal benefits rather than targeted benefits is that it promotes or generates less opposition in the society at large to helping specific groups. If you want to have affirmative action, for example, it's much better to target that broadly towards poor people rather than picking out ethnic minorities within that group. That's really an important thing to do, to make sure that no group feels targeted against or discriminated against in the process of helping other groups.
Kirsten, tenemos espacio para dos preguntas más del público, así que una para ti, Kirsten, y una para Roberto.
Yes, one question about the international development agencies. What role do you think, Francis, that the international development agencies play in countries such as Chile so that they can advance towards greater equality, equity in general and also specifically as regards gender and race or horizontal inequalities? Is the concept of horizontal inequalities, has that even had an impact on how they think? Has it been incorporated into their agenda? And perhaps we have to distinguish here between different international development agencies as well.
Well, there are two parts to that question. Let me just do the second first. Horizontal inequalities are beginning to be incorporated into the thinking of development agencies with respect to what they call fragile states. Conflict, countries they fear may go into conflict. And I have done quite a bit of work, for example, with the World Bank, with DFID, our development agency, and so on that issue. With UNDP, a lot of work. So in terms of fragile states, yes. Where we have yet to really get progress is it being accepted that this is an important issue for all countries. It's not just a question for fragile states. Now, the second part of the question was what role should development agencies have in Chile? I'm not sure they should have a role in Chile. I think Chile has moved beyond the need for assistance from development agencies. I think regional agencies may be helpful to comparative evidence and things like that, but I'm not at all sure that the development agencies would be helpful. They might even be unhelpful if they came here.
Una pregunta que nos hace Federico Viertel. ¿El miedo genera distancia entre las personas? ¿La dominancia es una herramienta para vencerlo? ¿Es el miedo una base fundamental de la inequidad? Jim.
Fear can be one tool or one avenue by which aggression between groups is generated. But it's not the same phenomena as dominance orientation. Dominance orientation is this tendency to want to control others and exploit others and take away their goods and power and economics. That's sometimes associated with fear, but all of our research so far has shown that it comes from a different psychological root than fear. But on the other hand, politically, you can mobilize in-groups to use aggression against out-groups by generating fear of the out-group. It helps, but it's not absolutely necessary. It's simply a tool that makes it easier to exploit and discriminate against other groups.
That tendency to dominance that you mentioned from male is something that you can change, or is something that you are born with and that's it? I mean, can female learn, or that have psychological approach? And how can we learn? I would love to know that.
I don't think it can be eliminated in the male soul. I think it's something endemic to men as a group, not that every man is dominant over every woman, but on average.
That has to do with education or what?
As far as we know, nothing really diminishes the dominance orientation between men and women. It's impervious to educational levels. It's impervious to the amount of political power or in political empowerment of women. It seems to be a constant across societies. What we can do is manage it, recognize that it's there, and do everything in our power to control it, to make sure it doesn't get out of hand. But eliminating it, I don't think, is going to be possible unless we change our nature as a species. And we share this patriarchy together with other related species, like chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans. We all have this tendency towards male domination.
Thank you. And last question. Do you have another one, Kirsten? Or are you done?
I thought you were finished. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Bueno, estas han sido algunas de las preguntas. Yo sé que hay muchas más. Son muy interesantes los profesores que han sido invitados a este lanzamiento. Yo creo que esperamos que hayan sido algunas pinceladas que hayan podido disfrutar. Y de esta manera estamos cerrando este lanzamiento, deseándole el mejor futuro para este nuevo centro de estudios sobre la cohesión social. Los invitamos ahora a disfrutar de un cóctel. Gracias.